The humidity in Milne Bay isn't just a weather condition, it is a physical entity. A suffocating weight that clings to skin, rots boot leather in a matter of days, and makes gunmetal sweat an oily condensation that smells of rust before the day even breaks. And it is in this cauldron of mud and rot on the eastern tip of New Guinea, August 1942, that imperial Japanese arrogance is about to collide with a reality of tempered steel and smokeless powder they failed to predict. For up there, crossing the Solomon Sea at 10,000 feet, the formation of Mitsubishi G4M1 medium bombers, those flying cigars the Allies call Betty, and which the Japanese pilots themselves, in a dark humor born of the vulnerability of their wing fuel tanks, call one-shot lighters, flies with a geometric discipline that borders on insolence. Led by Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato, a veteran of the China campaign who looks down at the impenetrable green carpet of the jungle and sees not a threat, but a logistical inconvenience, a static target inhabited by men. His intelligence reports described with almost pathological disdain, calling them second-rate conscripts, hastily armed farmers, a bush league unworthy of the Imperial Navy elite's attention, and this underestimation is not merely a tactical error. It is a death warrant signed in the ink of hubris, because down there, invisible under the canopy and buried in mud up to their ankles, men like Sergeant Arthur "Artie" Thompson of the Australian Light Anti-Aircraft Battery are not concerned with the glory of the Empire or the honor of samurai. They are concerned with keeping the mechanism of their 40mm Bofors guns free of the volcanic grit that infiltrates everything. Concerned with the malaria that makes their bones vibrate with fever even in the 80-degree heat, and above all, concerned with making every 4-round clip count, because they know what happens when the bombs fall. They have seen human flesh turned into red. Confetti in Rabaul and Darwin, and the visual memory of fragmented bodies mixed with black earth is not something erased by patriotic speeches. It is cold, hard fuel for hatred, and Artie Thompson, with hands calloused and stained with grease, checks the elevation system of his gun for the 10th time that morning. The metallic click of gears sounding like a clock counting down to the end of the world, while the sky above remains a deceptively innocent blue, masking the violence approaching at 200 miles per hour. And one must understand the psychology of this moment, the cognitive abyss between attacker and defender. For to Sato and his pilots, Australia is the end of the line, a stretch of land populated by a force that should have already capitulated before the inevitability of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They fly with the presumption of those who have never encountered a wall they couldn't knock down, habituated to skies where opposition was sporadic and inaccurate, where anti-aircraft fire was often little more than light arms fire, ineffective against even the light armor of their warbirds, and this complacency manifests in the tight formation, the constant altitude, the lack of evasive maneuvers. They are flying as if on an air parade over Tokyo, not entering the kill zone of gunners who have spent the last 6 months learning to calculate deflection and target speed with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, gunners who were called chocos, chocolate soldiers who would melt in the sun, by their own press at the war's start, an insult that now serves as a crust of bitterness over their souls, hardening them, stripping any hesitation from their trigger fingers, and as the distant drone of Kasei engines begins to vibrate the dense air, like the sound of a swarm of giant wasps trapped inside a bottle, Sergeant Thompson raises a hand, a simple gesture, almost lazy, but one that sends an electric current through his 5-man crew. The loader, Corporal Jack Davies, a kid from Brisbane who lied about his age to enlist, and now looks to have aged 20 years in 20 weeks, grabs the first clip of 40mm ammunition, the weight of cold brass and explosive warheads being the only tangible reality in a world that seems about to dissolve into chaos. And the sound grows, ceases to be a vibration, and becomes a physical roar pressing against eardrums, a mechanical dissonance announcing the arrival of tons of aluminum and high, explosive, and yet the guns remain silent, camouflaged under nets covered in rotting foliage, invisible to Sato's eyes up there, who adjusts his flight goggles and checks his instruments, his wingman's voice crackling on the radio with a casual observation about the lack of enemy fighters, a joke about how the Australians must be sleeping or running into the bush, and Sato allows himself a slight smile beneath his oxygen mask, a smile that will die on his face in exactly 45 seconds, because he does not know he is flying straight into the mouth of an integrated defense system that has been underestimated, ignored, and ridiculed, but which now, in the mud of Milne Bay, is about to write a new chapter in the physics of aerial destruction. And the contrast between the shiny, clean technology of the planes and the primordial filth of the anti-aircraft battery could not be greater. It is the confrontation between the industrialized 20th century and the timeless brutality of trench warfare. But the mathematics of ballistics does not care for cleanliness or honor. It cares only for vectors, velocity, and the point of intersection where a high-explosive shell meets a fuel tank full of volatile vapor. And it is at this point of intersection that history will be made, not with speeches, but with the deafening sound of a Bofors spitting fire at 120 rounds per minute, a sound reminiscent of a giant jackhammer breaking the sky itself, and when Thompson finally yells, "Fire!" The word is not a command. It is a release of accumulated tension, an exorcism of fear, and the clearing in the jungle explodes into frantic activity, the guns recoil, shaking the ground, empty casings being spat backward like useless golden coins, and the sky fills with tracers, lines of yellow light seeking the bombers with long, lethal fingers. And up there, Sato's world turns upside down. The first impact is not visual, it is sonic, a muffled thump-thump-thump that shakes the fuselage, followed by the scream of tearing metal. Because the Australians are not shooting randomly, they are using a box barrage technique, creating a wall of steel fragments in the formation's predicted path, and the Japanese pilots, conditioned to expect light and scattered fire, flew directly into it, like moths hypnotized by an arc lamp. And the Bush League, the League of Amateurs, has just presented its credentials in the most visceral way possible, transforming the immaculate formation into a confusion of black smoke and leaking oil, and the radio, once full of confidence and mockery, is now a chaos of screams and damage reports, voices cracking in panic as they realize intelligence was wrong, tragically, fatally wrong, and that the men down there are not farmers with shotguns. They are technical assassins armed with one of the most effective artillery pieces ever invented. And they are angry, a cold and calculated anger that guides every adjustment of the sights, every reload, every shot rising to meet the soft underbelly of the bombers. And on the ground, the smell of cordite begins to overpower the smell of rot, an acrid chemical incense marking the start of the ritual of sacrifice, where the human machine and the metal machine merge into a single purpose, the annihilation of what is above, and Davies, the loader, operates in a trance of muscle memory, grabbing clip after clip, ignoring the heat radiating from the barrel, ignoring the noise making his teeth. Tash! His eyes fixed on the gun's breech, feeding the insatiable beast, knowing that if he stops, if he fails, the bombs will fall, and he does not want to die in this god-forsaken mudhole. He wants to live, and to live, he has to kill, a simple and brutal logic governing every second of this confrontation. While up there the right wing of Lieutenant Tanaka's plane disintegrates, it doesn't break, it simply ceases to exist, severed by a direct 40mm hit that detonates the main spar, and the Betty begins a slow, obscene spin toward the jungle canopy, atop of fire and duralumin, carrying 7 men to oblivion, and no parachutes open. There is no time, only gravity claiming what is hers, and Sato watches, helpless, as his flank collapses, the perfect formation undone not by enemy fighters, but by those he despised, and the irony of this is as sharp as shrapnel, piercing his understanding of the world, forcing him to re-evaluate everything he was taught about the superiority of the Japanese spirit over Western matter, because Western matter is rising toward him at 2,900 feet per second, and it doesn't care about his spirit. It only wants to occupy the same space as his body, and this revelation, coming too late, is the true horror of this morning. The realization that war respects no narratives of racial superiority or manifest destiny. War respects only physics and violence applied with precision, and the Australian gunners, with their sweat-soaked shirts and oil-stained faces, are the masters of that physics today, applying lessons learned in the pain of previous defeat, turning the sky over Milne Bay into an aerial slaughterhouse where the Bush League is teaching a masterclass in destruction, and the noise is continuous, a thunder that does not cease, punctuated by the dry cracks of shells in the air, black clouds of flak blooming like malignant orchids around the remaining planes, forcing them to break formation, to scatter, to flee, abandoning their mission, abandoning their dignity, fighting only to keep their machines flying through the storm of steel. And amidst it all, Sergeant Thompson does not smile, does not celebrate. He merely adjusts the elevation, seeks the next target, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. A focused predator because he knows this is only the beginning, that they will return, and that the only way to survive is to ensure that the fewest possible number of them return to base to tell the tale. And so, the dance continues, a choreography of death staged against a backdrop of indifferent tropical beauty, where the vibrant green of the jungle is about to be stained with the red of blood and the black of burnt oil, and the words of Japanese officers, recorded in diaries recovered months later from smoking wreckage, will change tone from disdain to shock, from shock to fear, and finally to a grim resignation before the ferocity of these men they called amateurs, but who fight with the fury of cornered professionals, defending the northern gate of their continent with a determination no imperial propaganda could have predicted. And it is in this crucible that the legend of Australian artillery is being forged, not in polished parades, but in the dirty, noisy chaos of real combat, where the only prize for winning is living to fight another day, and the price for losing is becoming part of the all-consuming mud. The technical anatomy of a Bofors L-60 40mm shell is a marvel of lethal engineering that deserves to be understood to appreciate the devastation occurring at 10,000 feet. For it is not merely a piece of inert metal, it is a delivery package of destruction meticulously designed, consisting of an impact fuse sensitive enough to detonate upon striking an aircraft's duralumin structure, but safe enough not to explode in heavy rain, coupled with a charge of hexatonal high explosive that, upon detonating, fragments the pre-grooved steel casing into hundreds of incandescent shards, traveling at supersonic speeds, creating a cone of death that tears hydraulic lines, pierces oxygen tanks, and turns human flesh into unrecognizable pulp in a fraction of a millisecond. And when one of these shells meets the wing of a G4M Betty, which lacks self-sealing fuel tanks, a criminal designer mission born of the Japanese obsession with range and speed over crew protection, the result is not just structural damage, it is a thermodynamic catastrophe. The gasoline vapor in the wing tanks ignites instantly, transforming the aircraft into a flying torch before the pilot even has time to process the fire warning on the dashboard. And that is exactly what Lieutenant Commander Sato witnessed to his left, the plane of Sub-Lieutenant Yamamoto, a promising young man from Osaka who wrote haikus in his spare time, blossom into a ball of orange and black fire, a sight so violent and sudden it seemed to violate the laws of nature. And the sound of the explosion was audible even over the roar of his own engines, a dull crump that vibrated through Sato's stick, transmitting the death of his subordinates directly to his hands, and for the first time on that mission, cold liquid fear began to trickle into his stomach, replacing disdain, because those tracers down there were not stopping. They were getting more precise, adjusting, walking toward his own plane with a malevolent intelligence. Guided by men like Corporal Bluey Mitchell, the azimuth pointer on Thompson's gun, who cranked the handles with knuckles white from tension, eyes glued to the optical sight, ignoring the sweat running into them, stinging like acid, his world reduced to a crosshair and the silhouette of the lead bomber, growing and shrinking in his vision. And Mitchell didn't think of strategy, didn't think of geopolitics. He thought only of leading the target, of placing the sight ahead of the plane's nose, instinctively calculating the deflection needed for shell and plane to meet at the same point in spacetime. A ballistic equation solved not with calculators, but with instinct and thousands of hours of tedious practice under the scorching Queensland sun, practice now paying dividends in enemy blood. And the Bofors continued its hypnotic rhythm. Thump, 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 the barrel recoiling violently with each shot, spitting fire and smoke, the loader Davies now working like an automaton, his movements fluid and economic, grabbing, twisting, inserting, pushing, in a continuous cycle feeding the gun's hunger, and around them, Other guns of the battery had joined the chorus, creating a symphony of anti-aircraft destruction, saturating the air above the airstrip with flying metal, creating what aviators call a flak box, an interdiction zone where survival probability drops to near zero. And Sato, realizing his formation was being butchered, broke radio silence with a guttural scream, ordering evasive action, scatter, evasive action, jettison bombs. An order that admitted defeat, transforming a precision bombing mission into a disordered route for survival. Bombs being released prematurely, falling harmlessly into the jungle and swamp, exploding mud and mangrove in dirty geysers, far from the valuable targets of the runway and fuel depots, a colossal tactical waste forced by the ferocity of that bush league, refusing to behave like victims. And as Sato's plane banked, violently right, trying to exit the envelope of fire, he felt the impact of shrapnel on the rear fuselage, the sound of hail on a tin roof, followed by the muffled scream of his tail gunner. A sound cut abruptly short when the intercom died, and Sato knew, with the cold certainty of a veteran, that he was flying with a corpse behind him now. One more cost to be paid for his superior's arrogance, and as he wrestled with controls becoming heavy and sluggish, the image of the jungle below changed. In his mind, ceasing to be a passive green carpet to become a gaping mouth waiting to swallow him, a hostile, alien place where rough white men wielded magic weapons that could bring down the Emperor's hawks. And this shift in perspective, this inversion of power, was the central theme that would permeate post-war interrogations and recovered diaries, the disbelief at the enemy's lethal competence, the recurring question, who are these men? Why don't they run? And the answer, delivered in 40mm shells, was that they didn't run because they were defending the threshold of their own homes. And this motivation, primitive and powerful, was something Japanese tactical manuals failed to quantify. The tenacity of the man fighting with his back against the wall, and down below, Thompson saw smoke trailing from the leader's right engine, saw the plane yaw and lose altitude, and allowed himself a brief moment of grim satisfaction. "A gotcha, bastard," muttered through clenched teeth before traversing the turret to seek the next straggler, because the battle isn't over until the sky is clear or the ammo is gone, and they still had plenty of clips stacked in the ammo crates, covered in grease and ready to fulfill their destiny. And the heat rose, the sun now high in the sky cooking the mud and the men, turning the battery position into a humid oven, the smell of human sweat mixing with the smell of hot oil and cordite, creating the unmistakable perfume of combat, a scent that would stay impregnated in their clothes and memories for decades. The scent of the day they proved they were not amateurs, but the guardians of the sky, the executioners of bombers, and as the last of the Bettys disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind trails of smoke and wreckage burning in the distant jungle, a heavy silence descended over Milne Bay, not a silence of peace, but of exhaustion, the ringing in the gunners' ears replacing the roar of the cannons, and they looked at each other, faces dirty, chests heaving, and saw in each other's eyes the reflection of what they had done, the shared understanding that they had survived, and more than that, had won the first round of a fight that would be long and bloody. But in that moment, in that brief interval between death and life, they were kings. Kings covered in mud on a throne of empty ammo crates, watching the columns of black smoke marking their enemies' graves in the distant jungle. But silence is deceptive in war. It is merely the time death takes to reload, and Artie Thompson knew this. He could feel it in his bones, a residual vibration not coming from the ground, but from the air, the certainty that the humiliation they just inflicted would not go unanswered. The Empire does not accept insults, and losing 3 bombers to a battery of hicks was an insult demanding blood to wash away. So there was no celebration, no shouts of victory, only the metallic sound of tools, prying open new ammo crates, the sound of oil being applied to hot mechanisms, the sound of continuous preparation because they knew Japanese intelligence, however flawed in its initial assessment, was adaptable. And the next wave wouldn't come in parade formation. The next wave would come with hatred, would come low skimming the trees, or would come at night under the cover of tropical darkness, and they needed to be ready, needed to be harder than the metal of their guns, more relentless than the weather. And as Thompson wiped the breech of his gun with a filthy rag, He thought of his wife in Melbourne, of the letter in his shirt pocket, stained with sweat, a letter he still hadn't had the courage to finish reading because it spoke of a normal world, of butter rationing and Saturday night cinema, a world appearing to be on another planet, disconnected from this reality of mud and death. And this disconnection was a psychological wound they all carried, the feeling of slipping out of civilization, becoming creatures of instinct and reaction, where morality was simplified to us against them, and where empathy was a dangerous luxury that could make you hesitate, and hesitation meant death. So he pushed the image of his wife to the back of his mind, locked it in a safe compartment away from the horror, and focused again on the gun, on the cold, functional beauty of steel, his only true friend in this green hell. The only thing standing between him and annihilation, and beside him young Davies trembled, not from fear but from the adrenaline leaving his body, post-action shock beginning to set in, hands that had loaded the gun with machine precision now shaking so much he could barely hold his water canteen, and Thompson placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a heavy, firm touch saying nothing, because there was nothing to say, only the physical presence of another human being serving as an anchor in the storm. And this gesture, small and invisible in historical records, was the glue holding the army together. Not discipline, not patriotism, but brotherhood forged in fire, the tribal loyalty of men sharing the same hole in the mud and the same terror. And up there, far away, Lieutenant Commander Sato, now flying a plane riddled with holes, hydraulic system failing and his gunner's blood pooling on the fuselage floor, stared at the empty horizon and tried to formulate the words he would say to his commander, how to explain the unexplainable, how to describe the wall of fire that rose from nothing, how to justify the loss of precious men and machines to an enemy they had despised, and he realized there were no honorable words, only the raw, shameful truth. They were bested by gunners who shot like demons and turned the sky into a meat grinder, and this truth burned hotter than fire, corroding his warrior soul, planting the seed of doubt that would grow and spread like a cancer through imperial ranks in the coming months, the doubt that perhaps, just perhaps, they had awakened a giant they could not kill. A giant dressed in faded khaki and armed with Bofors, waiting in the mud to devour them. And as his damaged plane limped back to Rabaul, Sato knew the war had changed, that the days of easy victories were over, and that the future would be made of blood, lots of blood, and most of it would be theirs. And it is crucial to understand the depth of this trauma, to dissect the Japanese military culture of the time, Bushido distorted by militaristic nationalism, preaching that the offensive spirit was everything, that defense was for the weak, and that Western equipment was inferior because it lacked the spiritual purity of its Japanese counterpart, a doctrine that worked well against demoralized colonial armies in Malaya and Singapore, but which was hitting its absolute limit against the Australians in New Guinea. For the Australians didn't fight for a divine emperor. They fought for a stubborn pragmatism, a cultural refusal to be intimidated by bullies, a national trait distilled in the phrase "bugger off," which, translated into artillery language, meant putting 4 high explosive rounds in the air every 2 seconds until the problem disappeared. And this philosophical difference was as lethal as the technological difference. It was the clash between warrior mysticism and industrial materialism, and in Milne Bay materialism was winning, shattering mysticism with every detonation, proving that spirit cannot deflect steel shards and that the will to win does not replace adequate armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Lessons the Imperial Japanese Navy was learning too late, at the cost of its best pilots and crews, men who could not be replaced, whose training took years and whose lives were spent in minutes of tactical madness over a muddy airstrip at the end of the world. And the tragedy of it, the grim irony permeating the entire history of the Pacific War, is that these men, both attackers and defenders, were pawns in a game they barely understood, thrown against each other by distant political forces, forced to kill each other in a setting of stunning natural beauty, where toucans flew between tracers and colorful corals were crushed by landing barges, a juxtaposition of paradise and hell that drove the sensitive mad and hardened the survivors, turning them into something other than human, something older and more dangerous. And Artie Thompson, looking at the empty sky, felt this transformation in himself, felt the part of him that used to worry about the future wither and die, replaced by absolute focus on the now, on the next clip, the next target, the next breath, a reduction of existence to the essential, a terrible purity only war can provide, and he spat on the ground, a mixture of saliva and cordite dust, and went back to work, because the work never ended. The gun needed cleaning, the crates needed stacking, and the sky, that damn blue indifferent sky, needed watching, for death would come from there again. He was absolutely sure of it, and next time he would be waiting. Not as a frightened farmer, not as an amateur from a minor league, but as the instrument of a nation's vengeance. A man fused to his machine, ready to turn arrogance into wreckage once more. The sun begins to descend, bringing no relief, only a shift in the quality of the heat, making it heavier, more oppressive, while jungle shadows lengthen like black fingers trying to reach the battery. And with the night comes real fear, primitive fear of what cannot be seen. Because the Japanese is master of the night, he moves in darkness like a ghost, and while Bofors are formidable weapons against visible targets, they are useless against infantry infiltration, against the silent bayonet to the throat. And so anxiety changes shape, ceasing to be the acute tension of aerial combat to become the chronic paranoia of perimeter watch, every snap of a twig sounding like a shot, every cry of a nightbird sounding like an attack signal, and men rotate in guard shifts, eyes red with fatigue, scanning the tree line, fighting sleep, pulling their eyelids like lead weights. Knowing sleep is death, and it is in these long, lonely hours that the mind begins to play tricks, seeing movement where there is nothing, hearing voices in the wind, ghosts of the dead coming back to haunt the living. And Thompson, sitting by his gun, smokes a hand-rolled cigarette, shielding the ember with a cupped palm, a small point of heat and light in the hostile vastness. And he thinks of the pilots he downed today, not with hate, but with morbid curiosity, wondering who they were, what they thought as they fell, if they had wives waiting for them in cities of paper and wood across the ocean. And this momentary humanization is dangerous, he knows. So he crushes it, like he crushes the cigarette butt in the mud, snuffing out empathy before it can take root, because tomorrow he will have to do it all again, and he cannot afford the luxury of seeing the enemy as human. He must see him only as a target, a vector, a threat to be neutralized. And this necessary dehumanization is the true cost of war, the price he pays with pieces of his own soul, each time he pulls the trigger, an installment plan he will keep paying for the rest of his life, long after the guns fall silent and the jungle reclaims the plane wreckage, covering twisted aluminum with vines and moss, hiding the earth's scars, but never the scars in the minds of the men who were there. Dawn arrives like an accusation, not with the soft pastels of a peaceful world, but with a brutal clarification of detail that exposes the wreckage of the previous day's violence, the blackened metal bones of a Betty protruding from the jungle canopy like a tombstone, smoke still lazily curling from the crater where the fuel tanks cooked off, and the stench that arrives with the morning breeze is one that will haunt these men forever. The sweet, sick smell of burned human flesh mixing with aviation fuel and scorched rubber, a scent so visceral it bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the reptilian brain that understands only predator and prey, life and death. And Artie Thompson, who has not slept more than 20 minutes in fragmented intervals, stands at his gun position with eyes that feel like they've been rolled in sand, watching the steam rise from the jungle as the sun begins its work of transforming Milne Bay back into a sauna. And he knows, with the certainty, born of 6 months in this green hell, that today will bring more of the same, that the Imperial Japanese Navy does not forgive humiliation, that somewhere north of here in Rabaul or Leh, briefing rooms are filled with angry officers demanding retribution, demanding that the Bush League gunners be silenced permanently. And this knowledge sits in his stomach like a stone, not fear exactly, but a weariness so profound it feels like gravity has increased, pulling him down toward the mud that wants to swallow everything. And around him the battery is a study in controlled exhaustion, men moving with the mechanical precision of the sleep-deprived, checking ammunition counts, cleaning firing mechanisms with a devotion that borders on obsessive. Because the gun is life, the gun is the only thing between them and the 1,000 ways to die that this war has invented. and Corporal Jack Davies, the young loader, whose hands still bear the blisters from yesterday's sustained firing, sits on an empty ammo crate eating cold bully beef straight from the tin, not tasting it, just refueling the machine of his body. And his eyes are different now, Thompson notices. Harder, with a distance in them that wasn't there before, the look of a man who has crossed an invisible line and can never return to the person he was. And this transformation, repeated across thousands of young men in hundreds of positions across the Pacific, is the true mathematics of war, not the tonnage dropped or the miles gained, but the conversion of innocence into something darker, something necessary for survival but corrosive to the soul. And the radio, crackling with static and distant voices, brings news that is both expected and dreaded. Coast watchers reporting formations heading south from Rabaul, larger than yesterday, and the voice of the controller, a tired officer back at headquarters whose name Thompson doesn't know and never will, speaks with a calmness that is either courage or resignation, detailing vectors and estimated time of arrival, 30 minutes, maybe less. And the battery comes alive not with panic but with a grim purposefulness, the ritual of preparation now familiar. Clamps released, traverses tested, ammunition stockpiled within arm's reach, and Thompson runs through the mental checklist one more time, knowing that in combat there is no time to think, only to react, and the reactions must be drilled so deeply into muscle memory that they bypass consciousness entirely, the gun becoming an extension of his body, the crew becoming a single organism with one function, to throw steel into the sky and make it meet flesh, and the waiting begins again. That special torture of combat where time becomes elastic, seconds stretching into hours, and every man is alone with his thoughts, and those thoughts are rarely heroic. They are mundane and profound simultaneously, wondering if this is the day, if the next formation will bring the bomb with your name on it, wondering if you'll die well or badly, quickly or slowly, wondering if anyone back home will remember you or if you'll just become another name on a memorial that people walk past without reading. And Bluey Mitchell, the pointer whose precision yesterday turned bombers into falling torches, sits by his position and looks at a photograph creased and stained from months in his pocket. A woman with dark hair and a smile that belongs to a different universe, his wife Sarah, and he tries to remember the sound of her voice, but finds it slipping away, replaced by the sounds of war, the concussion of guns and the scream of dying engines. And this forgetting terrifies him more than the prospect of death. The idea that he is losing pieces of himself, that the man who returns to Melbourne, if he returns, will be a stranger wearing his face, and he tucks the photograph away and picks up his tools, channeling the fear into action, tightening bolts that are already tight, because stillness is the enemy. Stillness allows thought, and thought in combat is a luxury that can kill you. And the sound builds again, that distant wasp hum that triggered yesterday's violence, but this time it's deeper, more complex. Multiple engine notes weaving together into a symphony of approaching threat, and through binoculars Thompson can see them, black dots resolving into shapes against the cloud deck, and there are more this time, 10 bombers in a loose formation, and higher, sunlight glinting off, wings, the deadly silhouette of A6M0 fighters, the escorts that were absent yesterday, the Imperial Navy's pride. And this changes everything, because the Bofors that are so lethal against bombers are vulnerable when they fire, revealing their positions to the fighters who can strafe with impunity, turning the hunters into the hunted. And Thompson feels the tactical calculation rearranging itself in his mind, the balance of risk shifting, but there is no choice really. There has never been a choice. The bombers must be stopped whatever the cost, because if they break through, if they crater the airstrip and ignite the fuel dumps, the entire position becomes untenable, and Milne Bay falls, and the door to Australia swings open, and that cannot be allowed, not on his watch, not while there is still ammunition in the boxes and breath in his lungs. And so he waits, watching the formation approach with a predator's patience, letting them commit, letting them enter the cone where his guns have maximum effect, and the Zeros are circling high, arrogant in their superiority, confident that the ground fire will be suppressed by their presence. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps at other positions along the coast, men are hesitating, weighing survival against duty, but not here. Not at Thompson's gun, because he has done the mathematics of sacrifice and accepted the equation, and when the bombers begin their run, wings leveling for the drop, he screams the order, and the world explodes into noise and fire once more, the Bofors hammering out its deadly rhythm, tracers arcing upward in beautiful, terrible parabolas, and the first impacts are immediate. A bomber on the left side of the formation, shuddering as shells walk through its fuselage, pieces of aluminum spinning away like leaves in a wind, and the radio is chaos, reports overlapping, other batteries firing, the net of steel thickening the air, and a Zero peels off from the high cover, rolling inverted and diving, its cowling mounted machine guns beginning to sparkle, and Thompson knows what is coming, can calculate the vector in his head. The fighter is targeting his position, and there is no time to take cover, no time to do anything but keep firing, keep the stream of shells going into the bomber formation, and Mitchell beside him never looks up, never acknowledges the fighter that is about to kill them, his entire being focused on the bomb site, cranking the wheels, walking the fire into the lead. Bomber's engine nacelle and the fighter's bullets arrive with the sound of a canvas tarp being ripped, geysers of mud erupting in a line that marches toward the gun, and Davies, the loader, makes a sound that is not quite a scream, more of a grunt of surprise, and drops. Blood spreading across his chest in a bloom of dark crimson, and there is no time to help him, no time for anything except grabbing the next clip himself. Thompson dropping his commander's role and becoming loader, becoming every role the machine must keep firing, and Mitchell is hit too. A round through his shoulder that spins him around, but his hands never leave the traverse wheel. He is welded to the gun by something stronger than flesh, by duty or pride or madness, and they keep firing. 2 wounded men and a gun against the sky, and the lead bomber above them is trailing smoke now, both engines burning, the pilot fighting controls that no longer respond, and his bomb load releases early, tumbling away toward the jungle, impacting 200 yards short of the runway in explosions that rattle teeth and collapse dugouts, and the bomber follows its bombs down, a meteor of aluminum and burning men, and it hits the tree line with a violence that seems to rip the air itself, a fireball rising into the morning sky, a pyre visible for miles, and the Zero that strafed Thompson's position is climbing away, mission accomplished in the pilot's mind, the gun below surely destroyed. But he is wrong. The gun is still firing more slowly now. Only 2 men to crew it, but the geometry is still correct, the shells still finding their marks. And the bomber formation is breaking apart, abandoning cohesion for survival, jettisoning bombs randomly, turning for home with the desperation of men who have seen their comrades immolated and want only to live through the next 30 minutes. And in the positions around Thompson, other guns are still hammering. The battery commander, Major Frank Harrison, a great war veteran who knows exactly what this is costing, directing fire with a voice like gravel, calling corrections, maintaining the barrage even as fighters strafe and men die. Because this is war stripped of all pretense, this is the simple calculus of will. Whoever can endure the most pain wins. And the Australians, it turns out, can endure quite a lot. They have been enduring since Gallipoli, since the Somme. Enduring is in their bones. A cultural stubbornness born of a harsh continent that kills the weak. And they are not weak. They are hard as the land that made them, and they will not break, not today. And the Japanese are learning this lesson in the most brutal way possible, watching their bombers fall like poisoned birds, watching the myth of invincibility crack and shatter. And up there in the cockpit of a struggling Betty, Lieutenant Commander Sato, back for a second day despite his better judgment, ordered by superiors who cannot accept what he told them, sees his worst fears. Confirmed, the wall of flak is even heavier than yesterday. The Australians have learned from the first engagement, adjusted their tactics, and now his squadron is being torn apart, and the radio is screaming. Voices of dying men, boys, really, engineers and bombardiers who trusted him to bring them home, and he cannot. He can save only himself, and perhaps not even that, because his own plane is shaking, instruments going crazy, hydraulic pressure dropping to 0, and the controls are sluggish, each movement requiring all his strength, and he knows this feeling, has felt it before over chunking. The feeling of a plane dying around you, systems failing in cascade, and there is a choice to make. Try to reach the sea, try to ditch where rescue might be possible, or stay with the plane too long and end up in the jungle, where only slow death waits, starvation or disease, or the Australians themselves, who are not known for taking prisoners in this theatre, not after what they found in the villages the Japanese passed through, and the guilt of survival wars with the instinct for it. And instinct wins, it always does, and he orders his crew to prepare to ditch, shouting over the noise of wind screaming through holes in the fuselage, and the co-pilot, young Ensign Takeshi Ito, just 20 years old, looks at him with eyes that hold no accusation, only acceptance, the fatalism that Japanese culture has cultivated for centuries, the understanding that death is simply death, neither good nor bad, merely a transition, and they struggle with the dying plane, coaxing it out over the water, losing altitude in a controlled crash more than a flight, and the sea rushes up to meet them, and the impact is catastrophic. The Betty was never designed for ditching, its aluminum skin crumpling like paper, and water floods the fuselage in a torrent, cold and violent, and Sato finds himself underwater, disoriented, lungs burning, fighting with straps that have become instruments of execution, and somehow he surfaces gasping, surrounded by debris and fuel oil, and he looks for his crew but sees only pieces of wreckage and one body floating face down, and the shame of survival is already settling into his soul, a weight that will press down for the rest of his life. Every breath a reminder that he lived when others died, and in the water he is just a man, rank and honor stripped away, treading water and waiting for rescue or sharks, whichever comes first. And the irony is, not lost on him, brought down not by enemy fighters in glorious dogfight, but by ground fire by men he was told were inferior. And this cognitive dissonance is as damaging as the physical trauma. It breaks something in the mind, shatters the narrative that gave meaning to the sacrifice. And back at Milne Bay, as the last of the bombers disappears trailing smoke, the silence that falls is punctuated by the moans of the wounded, and Thompson, hands shaking with adrenaline dump and delayed shock, looks down at Davies, at the boy who is now just meat and cooling blood and feels nothing, not yet. The numbness is protective, a mercy granted by the nervous system to prevent complete collapse, and Mitchell is being carried away by medics who work with the grim efficiency of men who have seen too much, and new loaders are arriving. Strangers, but it doesn't matter. They can be trained. They will be trained, because the guns must be manned, always, and Thompson stays at his position, running. It's on nothing but willpower and the muscle memory of duty, cleaning the gun again, checking the mechanisms, counting ammunition, preparing for the next wave, because there will be a next wave, and a wave after that, and after that, until one side or the other runs out of men or will, and he knows which side will run out first, can see it in the trajectory of the war. The Japanese have already shot their bolt, already spent their best men in the opening campaigns, and now they are grinding down, dying in chunks at places like Milne Bay, and the Allies, barely holding on, are learning, adapting, getting harder, and the end is not in doubt anymore. Not really. Only the question of how many more will die before it arrives. How many more Davies and Mitchells and nameless others will be fed into the machine before someone with stars on their collar decides enough is enough, and this knowledge is both comforting and terrible. Comforting because it means the suffering has meaning. Terrible because it means the suffering will continue, and he is so very tired, tired in his bones, tired in his soul, but the sun is still climbing. The day is still young, and the war does not care about his exhaustion. The war wants more, always more, and he will give it. Because that is what soldiers do. They give until there is nothing left to give, and then they give more. And the legend that will be written about this battle, the history that will call it a turning point, will miss all of this, will miss the smell and the fear and the bone-deep weariness, will reduce it to arrows on maps and casualty figures in neat columns, will sanitize it for public consumption, stripping away the humanity and leaving only the strategy. But the men who are here still, standing at their guns in the mud and the heat, they will know the truth, will carry it in their nightmares and their silences, in the 1,000-yard stares that their families will learn not to question. And when they are old, if they become old, and someone thanks them for their service, they will nod politely and say nothing, because how can you explain this to someone who wasn't there? How can you bridge the chasm between the world of peace and the world of war? And so the truth will die with them slowly, one funeral at a time, until all that remains is the sanitized version, the myth. And perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps some truths are too heavy for society to bear, and so the warriors bear them. Alone, a secret society bound by shared trauma, understanding each other with a glance across crowded rooms decades later, recognition passing between men who endured what cannot be spoken, and that is the real cost of Milne Bay. Not the planes destroyed or the tactical victory won, but the human cost, the pieces of soul left in the mud, irretrievable, the price paid so that others can sleep safely in their beds and never know, never truly know, what was done in their name in the green hell at the edge of the world. The rain begins not as a drizzle, but as a biblical deluge, a solid wall of water that obliterates visibility and turns the ground into a slurry of sucking mud in seconds, changing the tactical landscape from an aerial shooting gallery to a miserable amphibious endurance test, where the enemy is no longer the zero fighter, but the fungal rot that grows in boot leather and the dysentery that spreads through the water table. And Artie Thompson stands under a dripping canvas tarp, shivering violently as the temperature plunges, his body finally rebelling against the adrenaline overdose of the last 48 hours, shaking with a mixture of cold and the coming fever. But his eyes remain fixed on the grey curtain of rain where the jungle line used to be, because the Japanese don't stop for weather. In fact, they prefer it. They use the storm as a cloak, and intelligence reports, intercepted and decoded by men in windowless rooms in Brisbane, suggest that the landing forces are moving, that the Marines of the Kaigun Rikusentai, the Special Naval Landing Forces, are pushing through the swamp to flank the airstrip. And this means the Bofors crews might soon be fighting a ground war, depressing their barrels to zero elevation to fire point blank into charging infantry. A terrifying prospect for men trained to track aircraft at 3,000 feet, but a necessary adaptation in a war where the front line is fluid and everywhere at once. And Thompson checks his sidearm, a battered Webley revolver that feels pathetically inadequate against a bayonet charge. But it's all he has besides the Bofors, and he looks at his new crew, the replacements sent up from the reserve pool. Kids, really, faces pale with terror, looking at him as if he's some kind of god of war because he survived yesterday. And he wants to tell them he's not a god, he's just lucky, and luck runs out. But he stays silent, letting them have their illusion, because hope is a weapon too, however fragile. And they huddle together under the canvas, sharing cigarettes that are too damp to stay lit, listening to the rain hammer the metal of the gun like 1,000 drumsticks, waiting for the scream of a banzai charge or the crack of a sniper's rifle. And in the distance, muffled by the storm, comes the sound of mortars, thump, 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 walking closer, probing the perimeter. And Thompson knows the night will be long, longer than any night has a right to be, and he thinks about the Japanese officer he saw floating in the bay earlier, before the sharks came, a man who looked surprisingly peaceful in death, stripped of the fanaticism that drove him here, just a collection of organic matter returning to the carbon cycle. And Thompson wonders if that's the only peace available to them, the peace of non-existence. And the thought is seductive, almost comforting, until the first mortar round lands 50 yards away, spraying mud and shrapnel against the sandbags, snapping him back to the ugly, necessary business of staying alive, and he barks orders he barely hears himself. "Stand to, eyes open." And the crew scrambles, slipping in the mud, taking positions around the gun that is now pointed horizontally at the tree line, a 40mm shotgun waiting for the first shadow to move. And the waiting is the worst part, the imagination filling the darkness with monsters. But the monsters are real. They are out there, wet and cold and hungry, and driven by a code of honor that demands their death or his. And there is no negotiation, no common ground, only the physics of kinetic energy and biological fragility. And somewhere in the darkness, a twig snaps, not from the wind, but with the distinct sharp crack of a boot on dry wood that shouldn't be dry. And Thompson freezes, hand raising to signal silence. And they listen, hearts hammering against ribs like trapped birds. And then it comes, not a shout but a whisper of movement, the grass parting, and Thompson fires a flare, the pistol bucking in his hand, and the magnesium star rises, hissing, painting the clearing in stark, wavering light. And there they are, a patrol, maybe 12 men, frozen for a split second like deer in headlights, mud-caked, bayonets fixed, eyes wide with the shock of exposure. And then the Bofors opens up, thump, thump, thump. The sound deafening at ground level, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark. And at this range, the 40mm shells don't just kill, they erase, hitting torsos and turning them into mist, tearing through trees behind the men, destroying cover and flesh indiscriminately. A massacre of mechanics over biology. And it's over in seconds. The patrol annihilated before they could fire a shot, leaving only the ringing in ears and the smell of hot blood rising to mix with the rain. And Thompson stops firing, chest heaving, smoke curling from the barrel, and he looks at what he's done, at the piles of rags and meat that were men a moment ago, and he feels a sickness rising in his throat, not moral revulsion. He's past that, but a physical reaction to the sheer waste of it all. The industrial efficiency of the slaughter, and the replacements are staring, mouths open, horrified and awed, seeing for the first time what their weapon actually does to human bodies, and Thompson spits into the mud. Clear. The breach. Reload. They'll send more, because they always send more. The Empire has plenty of suns to spend, and the night is young and the rain keeps falling, washing the blood into the soil of Milne Bay, feeding the roots of the jungle that doesn't care who wins, only that it gets fed. And miles away in a command tent leaking water onto maps, General Close is reading reports that confirm the Japanese advance has stalled, that the Bush League gunners and the infantry battalions are holding the line, turning the swamp into a killing ground, and he permits himself a moment of relief, lighting a pipe with trembling hands, knowing that this might be the turning point, the moment the tide stops rising and begins to ebb. But he also knows the cost, sees the casualty lists that grow longer every hour, names of boys from Queensland and New South Wales who will never go surfing again, never shear a sheep, never hold a child, and the weight of command is a physical burden, a crushing responsibility to spend lives wisely, if such a thing is even possible. And back at the gun pit, the adrenaline fades, leaving the cold to seep back in, and Thompson sits on a crate, cleaning his revolver, trying not to look at the shapes in the clearing, trying to focus on the metal, the oil, the spring tension, the simple, solvable problems of mechanics, because the problems of the human heart, the questions of why and what for, those are unsolvable here. Those are for later, for the survivors who will wake, up screaming in sweat-soaked sheets 40 years from now. But for tonight, there is only the rain, the gun, and the waiting, always the waiting, while the ghosts of the dead gather at the edge of the light, silent witnesses to the madness of their brothers. And in the silence, Thompson realizes he has forgotten what silence sounds like. True silence. Peace. It's a foreign concept now, a memory of a memory, and he wonders if he will ever hear it again, or if the sound of the Bofors will echo in his skull until the day he dies, a permanent tinnitus of war. And then the radio crackles again. Bogies inbound, Vector 290. And he stands up, groaning, joints stiff, and looks at the sky, clearing now as the storm passes, revealing a moon that shines down on the carnage with a cold, detached beauty, illuminating the path for the next wave of bombers. And he thinks, come on then, you bastards. We're still here, and racks the slide of the Bofors, ready to write another verse in the poem of destruction, ready to defend this patch of mud until the end of time, or until the ammo runs out, whichever comes first. The interception of the Japanese signals, later known as the Rabaul transmissions, provides a forensic insight into the disintegration of morale among the attackers, a psychological collapse documented in real-time Morse code bursts, where the initial arrogant reports of weak resistance on day 1 devolve by day 3 into frantic requests for suppression fire and bewildered observations about the accuracy of the Australian flak, with one specific message from a flight leader, Captain Kuroda, stating, "The air is solid with iron, they do not miss. It is like flying into a volcano," a quote that would be classified for decades, but which perfectly encapsulates the shift in reality. For the men on the ground had ceased to be targets and had become active participants in the denial of airspace, operating their guns with a feral cunning, moving positions at night to confuse Japanese spotters, creating dummy emplacements with logs painted black to draw bombs, playing a deadly game of shell game where the prize was survival, and Artie Thompson, now running a fever of 102 degrees, shivering so hard his teeth chatter against the lip of his canteen, directs this deception with the clarity of the delirious, ordering his crew to drag the heavy gun 50 yards through knee-deep mud to a new firing arc. A Herculean effort that leaves them gasping and vomiting with exertion, but when the morning raid comes, the Zeros strafe the empty pit where they were an hour ago, chewing up sandbags and logs while Thompson's crew watches from the camouflage, off the tree line unseen, waiting for the bombers that follow the fighters. And when they open fire from the new angle, it's a slaughter, a perfect enfilade that catches the Betty formation in the side, the Bofors shells raking through the fuselages from wingtip to wingtip, hitting engines, pilots and bomb bays in a single devastating pass, and 2 bombers fall immediately, colliding in mid-air in a tangle of wreckage that rains down like fiery confetti, and the remaining planes scatter in panic, dropping their payloads into the ocean, fleeing the ambush. And Thompson doesn't cheer, he doesn't have the energy. He just leans against the hot barrel of the gun, sliding down until he's sitting in the mud, laughing a dry, hacking laugh that sounds like a seal barking. A sound of pure hysteria teetering on the edge of madness, because it worked, the trick worked, and they are still alive. And the absurdity of it all, the game of hide-and-seek played with high explosives, strikes him as hilariously funny in a way that only the doomed can understand, and his crew looks at him with worry, thinking the sergeant has finally cracked. And maybe he has. Maybe the crack is where the light gets in. Or maybe it's just where the sanity leaks out. But he pulls himself up, wipes the mud from his eyes and says, "Get the drag ropes." We move again. Because staying still is death, and they have to be ghosts, they have to be everywhere and nowhere. A phantom battery that kills and vanishes, haunting the nightmares of the Imperial Navy. And so the labor begins anew, the straining of muscles, the cursing, the sucking sound of boots in muck, moving the tons of steel to another patch of jungle, another ambush point, playing the game until the board breaks or the players die. And meanwhile, in the hospitals of Port Moresby, the wounded from the first days are arriving, men with shrapnel-torn bodies and eyes that stare at nothing, telling stories of the mad gunners of Milne, a legend growing in the telling, of crews that refused to retreat, that fired until the barrels melted, that stood up to the sons of heaven and spat in their faces. And this legend travels back to Australia, to the newspapers that print headlines about the heroes of the North, sanitizing the grime and the horror, turning the desperate struggle for survival into a noble crusade. But Thompson doesn't read newspapers. He reads the sky, and the sky tells him that the enemy is hurting but not dead, that the beast is wounded and dangerous, and as the sun sets on the 3rd day, painting the clouds in bruises of purple and red, he checks the ammunition stocks and finds them dangerously low, only 20 clips left, 80 rounds between them and defenselessness, and the supply trucks haven't come, bogged down in the trackless soup of the rear areas, and he knows that tomorrow, if the resupply doesn't arrive, they will have to fight with rifles and bayonets. Artillerymen turned infantry, a last stand in the mud, and he takes out his knife and starts carving his name into the breech casing of the gun. A. Thompson, scratching the letters deep into the steel, a way of saying I was here, a testament in metal that will outlast his flesh, and seeing this, the rest of the crew does the same, adding their names, a roster of the damned etched into the machine that binds them together, a totem of their existence in this green void, and they sleep in shifts around the gun, touching it like a talisman, praying to the god of ballistics that the trucks will come, that the dawn will bring shells and not Zeros, and the jungle watches, indifferent, buzzing with insects that feed on the dead, the cycle of life churning on, unconcerned with the petty struggles of men, and in the distance, the rumble of thunder or artillery. It's hard to tell the difference anymore, marks the rhythm of the night, a heartbeat of violence that never truly stops, only pauses to catch its breath. The recovery of Lieutenant Commander Sato's flight log, found washed ashore weeks later in a watertight pouch attached to a piece of floating debris, offers the final, tragic perspective of the attacker. The last entry, written in shaky kanji just before his final sortie on day 3, reading, "We are being spent like coins by men who do not know the value of gold. These Australians fight not with spirit, but with a cold, mechanical fury that terrifies my men. We are the samurai, but they are the blacksmiths, and they are hammering us on an anvil of fire. I do not expect to return. Tell my wife I died well, even if I die for nothing. This realization, that the spiritual superiority they were promised was a lie, is the core of the tragedy, the shattering of a worldview upon the hard rocks of industrial warfare, and as Sato's replacement, a young, zealous captain named Tanaka, leads the next morning's raid, he does so with a blindness that borders on criminal, ignoring the lessons of the previous days, ordering a low-level attack to frighten the defenders, a tactic that might have worked in China, but here is suicide. And Thompson, watching them come in low over the water, skimming the waves, can't believe his eyes, can't believe they are making it this easy, and he holds his fire, holds it until the Zeros are so close he can see the pilots' heads in the cockpits, can see the oil streaks on the cowlings. And then, at point-blank range, he unleashes the last of his ammo, the Bofors bucking violently, shells tearing into the lead Zero, blowing the engine block back into the cockpit, vaporizing the pilot instantly, and then shifting to the next, and the next, a scythe of high explosive cutting through the formation. And it's not a battle, it's an execution. Planes cartwheeling into the sea, exploding in balls of steam and fire, skipping across the water like stones, and the surviving planes break hard, banking away in sheer terror, abandoning the attack runs, fleeing the trap, and silence returns, sudden and ringing. And Thompson squeezes the trigger again, but only a click follows. The magazine is empty, the last shell spent, and he slumps over the gun, dry firing at the retreating dots. Click, 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 impotent rage mixing with relief. And then the sound of engines comes from the other direction, from the land side, and for a moment he thinks they are flanked, that it's over, but it's the grinding roar of a truck, a muddy, battered 66, struggling through the mire, loaded with crates, the resupply finally, arriving like the cavalry in a bad western, and the driver leans out, grinning, tossing a pack of cigarettes. Bit close, mate. And Thompson just stares at him, unable to speak, unable to bridge the gap between the edge of death and this casual greeting, and he lights a cigarette with shaking hands, the smoke tasting like life, like survival, and he looks at his crew, at the names carved in the gun, and nods, a small, imperceptible movement that says everything. We made it. We're still here. Load the damn gun because the war isn't over. It's just taking a lunch break, and they have work to do. The endless, bloody work of keeping the sky from falling on their heads. Dismantling the myth of imperial invincibility, one 40mm shell at a time, until the job is done or they are.